This is an interview with David Reimer, a storyteller and an entrepreneurship educator who helps founders turn products into narratives people actually care about. He's the author of Get Your Startup Story Straight and teaches a product management course on building strategic narratives that can drive product market fit. You can read more about David Reimer on our website, 6degrees.blog, and our Instagram page, 6 Degrees Away. Thank you and enjoy this video.
What emerging research or unanswered questions in storytelling and entrepreneurship are you most excited to explore next? And where do you think founders should experiment?
Well, I mean, from a storytelling standpoint, obviously the question that I get nowadays is how can AI help with storytelling? And I think it's quite interesting because there's great potential for it to really help people who aren't experienced storytellers to advance their craft. But it's certainly not going to replace their role in telling the story, the human's role in telling the story. And we can get into that more if you want as we go. But the sort of the headline there is any chatbot can help you put together, spit out a potential narrative around what it is you're trying to do. But you need to have the smart strategic inputs, and you need to understand the great customer insights and discover the customer insights that are at the core of the story. And you as a human also need to check your own experience and your experience with potential customers or existing customers to uncover authentic stories that are original and that aren't from what's already out there and what ChatGPT would access. So again, it can help us with all sorts of structural things and show us what would make a good story, but it can't make an authentic story and it can't get at the customer insight. And that's what we as humans have to do.
So you think as humans we should work with ChatGPT, not rely on it as a sole resource?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a place for both the human still in the equation and the tool. And I mean, for example, we have a course that we teach, a product management course, where we teach people how to build a narrative around what they're working on, and then to turn it into a story that can excite people about the innovation they're creating. And you can use the tool to show you, hey, this would be a good story about that. The problem is that what you can't do is uncover that thing that's truly human. I'm always saying that at the core of every great story is some human motivation that takes some work to discover. And we, as the human in the equation, have to figure out what that is. And then once we have that, we have to try and find real stories that demonstrate that, and not just rely on whatever ChatGPT is going to give us or any other AI tool, because they're going to give us something that already exists, or they're going to fabricate something. They're not going to tell a true story, and that's where we come in.
Do you think there is or maybe not now, but do you think there will be an age where it comes to the how good the prompt is, how good humans are at prompting to ChatGPT, and maybe one day it'll be able to make individual stories?
Uh, yeah, I mean, I think you could take any actual story and potentially make it better using an AI tool, but the AI is not going to discover an experience that you personally had. So, for example, if you're the customer and you had an experience and it was so profound that you said, I want to fix this. So many great entrepreneurial stories are stories of people who were working in their job and they hated the process they were going through, and they're like, the hell with this. I'm quitting my job and I'm actually going to fix this problem. When that's your story, and you're trying to figure out the best way to tell that story, yes, working with a tool like AI, you might be able to continue to refine the story and have it help you tell your own story better. But you still have to start by figuring out what is that great story, whether it's your story, whether it's a true customer story. And again, maybe you can use AI over time to help refine it and improve upon it.
So now I'll move on to the next question. How do the three acts in Get Your Startup Story Straight map onto a startup's real growth phases? So problem, solution fit, product market fit, and scaling. And where do founders most often get stuck in that arc?
Yeah. So in the three acts of the book, I talk about how to structure a story, then how to use tools to tell the story, and then the third piece is a little bit more about story archetypes that can inspire you. There's no question that the early part in terms of structuring a story is essential to that very first role of the creator, which is to figure out the product market fit for the thing they're creating. Because so many times people come up with something and think, oh, I think this would be really great. to fix a problem. But as they get into it, they realize they haven't really considered who is the best customer for this thing. And once you figure out who you think the best customer is, you may not understand that customer as well as you thought you did. It might even be a different customer than you originally imagined. And every time you go through and investigate and interrogate any one of the bits of the product market fit, you're learning something and making changes. And that's all changing the narrative. So the narrative structure that I teach in the book is a strategic tool that teaches you as the creator how to figure out that first product market fit. Who's the customer? What do we know about the customer? What problem are you going to choose to solve for the customer? If you solve it, what's the benefit to the customer? What are you creating to solve the problem? What are you creating that's in the context of the other solutions people are using? How is it better than the other things that are out there? Those are all essential elements of getting a product market fit. And that's at the beginning of my book where I talk about structure. Later in the book, I start talking about methods and tools to make your story more interesting, more compelling, more memorable, and then even some story archetypes to set as models for people. And as you're starting to develop the story and get it out there into the world and sharing it with people, those techniques can help you get people really excited about what you're doing. Because remember, anytime you're trying to get a new idea out there, you're going up against severe headwinds. One headwind is there's a million other ideas out there that people are hearing. What's so exciting about this one? Another headwind is, well, don't we already have something that solves that problem? You're telling me you've come up with a better way to get people from here to there in town. What's wrong with taxis? Well, Uber had to come along and help people understand how a rideshare service was better than taxis. When people came into the meeting thinking taxis are fine, black town cars are fine, public transportation is fine. Why do I need this new thing? That's another huge headwind. And then the third headwind is that people have to decide, like, I'm going to put either my money into this, I'm going to quit my job and join you as a team member. I'm going to try this product. And what people have to do to make the commitment to join you, those are huge commitments that people have to make. So to inspire people to get over all those things that are flying in your face when you're trying to get a new idea off the ground, you need a story that's really memorable and fun and compelling, so that people are like, yeah, I want to try that thing.
And is there a single signal that maybe you look for to know that a team is ready to leave Act One?
Um, I guess if they get out there and they start talking to people who are prospective customers and they start nodding their head, then you're probably on to something. Sometimes you need to actually go to Act 2 and Act 3 in the book to be able to tell the story in such a way that you can get them interested. But usually if you start describing a problem to someone that you think is the customer, and they're nodding there, you go, yeah, that's me. And you just start describing how they feel about the problem. You go, how did you know how I feel about that? If they're nodding like that, and you say, well, what would you say if I told you I could fix that problem so that you'd be able to do this thing you can't do now? That would be amazing. And then you tell them, and by the way, we think this is better than the other ways you could do this. If people are nodding their heads as you're going through that narrative, and they're thinking that sounds pretty cool and compelling, then you probably have the right thing to start to test to really see how can I make this as compelling as possible. But I don't know that people necessarily, take that step and then they go, oh, now that I've done that step, now I'm going to move on to the other thing. It's kind of more, it tends to be a little more fluid in the real world.
And is there a single spot where you see that founders or teams get stuck in the most? And if so, what do you suggest for those founders?
Well, people get stuck in their own biases around, they fall in love with their original story. And their original story isn't always the right story. And the whole purpose of building a narrative, we call these strategic narratives for your innovation, is to basically vet your view of the world, right? So you have this view of the world. I'll give you an example, and this is something I know you wanted to ask me about, an example of someone who really learned from this process. There's a group, a couple of people who founded a company where their goal was to go out and create effectively a Yelp for small business. You're a small business, you want to get a business card that tells people what you do, although that's an archaic thing, but imagine that something you might have wanted to do back in the day. And you go out and try and find different places that were good printers for making a business card or a brochure or something that you might have done, or maybe someone, a web services company to make a website or social media, which would be a little bit more current day version. They started down the path and they started interviewing small businesses to ask them about the problem of finding these resources. And every time they started talking about a small business, a local small business, about their biggest problems, all they could talk about was how much they hated Craigslist for hiring. It's not what they were asking them about, but it's what universally they come back and they go, you know what? Craigslist really sucks. It's horrible. And here's why it's horrible. And they detail all the reasons. And eventually these two founders, Ben and Maya, they were like, you know what? That's a much bigger problem. We should solve that problem. And so they pivoted. And this is from, again, working through this basic storyboard narrative. They're like, we got the right customer, these small businesses, but we're solving the wrong problem. We need to solve this local hiring problem. And they then pivoted to solve that problem. They built a company called LocalWise. They built a local job service in markets around the country. And then they eventually sold it to a larger job site and had a nice exit by doing that. The point is, they had to be open-minded to a different story than the one they started with. And I think that's often a problem for founders, that they're so convinced that this initial concept is right, they're not willing to listen to the market to tell them, and maybe it's something else.
I think you might have already sort of answered this question, but can you walk us through a specific case where the 6-frame narrative storyboard changed a product roadmap or go-to market strategy, and what measurable outcome followed?
Yeah, so I just gave you that example, right? That was the LocalWise example. But I'll give you another example of something that I was just reading about, and this isn't necessarily someone who's worked with me and followed the 6-frame storyboard, but it's illustrative of going through this process. So when a company called Mint started, you ever heard of Mint?
No.
Okay. So Mint is a company that does. Let me back up and start this one over again. Mint is a company that makes it possible for people who want to buy stationery and designers who want to get their designers presented, that puts those people together. And when the person who created this company, Mariam Farsi, started down this path, she was originally just doing an e-commerce site for doing taking big giant companies that were in the stationery business and allowing those companies to just put their stuff up on the site, and people could come in and look at the designs and buy a design. She started down that path, and she was trying to solve this problem for consumers was an easier way of buying stationery. But what she discovered along the way is that there was a whole separate problem out there that needed to be solved. And that was the problem of independent designers looking to sort of break through these giant companies who controlled the market. And she around the time of the crowdsourcing started to come up as sort of an internet sort of trend around 2008, 2009, she had this thought that maybe I should just give that a shot. And maybe I should try and solve a different problem. So in that storyboard framework, when it came to solving the problem, she said, you know what? I'm going to put two customers into this mix. I'm not only going to solve the consumer's problem, I want to solve the designer's problem. And she ultimately did that, created a marketplace so that designers could feature their designs, consumers could choose those designs. And they were so popular that the major players who were the original people that she was putting in to be the products that she sold, she got rid of all of the major stationery companies and moved to this designer meets customer marketplace. And that was an example where going through this process, I realized there's a separate problem I need to solve, and it's actually for a separate set of customers, these designers. And if I do that well, I'll better serve the needs of the consumers who want to get stationery designs.
Why is casting the customer as the protagonist so powerful? And what exercises help founders truly internalize that perspective rather than reverting to we are product-centric stories?
Yeah, so let's start at the end of that question. Anytime a founder or a product person say, tell me what you're doing, if they start by describing the product-centric, solution-centric part, I just stop them in the middle of their sentence and I say, why should I care about that? And they're like, what do you mean? I said, I don't know who needs this. I don't know why they need it. You're just telling me you're creating this thing. Well, what should it? Well, back up. We need to build a narrative, right? And so what's useful in this equation is it forces the person creating the thing to picture the customer, to first of all make decisions about who their first target customer is, to get deep in the head of the customer so they could discover the kinds of things that will let them build a better product and tell a better story about it. And that usually comes from a deep understanding of the customer. If they think about their customer as a human and not an entity or a category of people, it's so much easier to get at that human motivator at the core of what they're trying to do. So, for example, another problem that I often have with founders, let's say they're doing a business-to-business thing, and I say, who's your customer? And they say, Fortune 500 companies. I said, there's no Fortune 500 companies in history that's ever bought a product. There are people who work in those companies who buy the products. There are people in those companies who use the products. They have roles, they have responsibilities, they have jobs they're trying to solve. I want to picture that individual in that company who has the problem, and maybe that's the same person who's buying it, maybe the purchaser's different, but I want to understand maybe both of those characters in the story. How can I build a solution for someone if I'm building it for a company? I need to know there's a person in the organization, they're a network engineer, and they're trying to do something with the stack of resources in their organization, and they're having this problem, and it's keeping them up at night, and this is how they feel about the problem. You can only do that if you center the customer and you make them the protagonist in the story. And that's the power of that exercise.
And this question is coming up. When a company is to advertise, if they are advertising to, let's say, a very diverse group of people, maybe not just one set of or one type of like I guess one genre of civilization, how should they go about this? Does it just make the narrative more complicated, or?
Well, it's so we're now sort of talking about two different things. There's but I will answer your question. On the one hand, there are people who are trying to start a company and they're trying to create a product from scratch, and they have to consider their first target audience, and they have to build a narrative that's compelling to their first target audience, and wherein they're going to be is going to drive them to build a product that first target audience is going to want. When Facebook was created, do you know how many customers Mark Zuckerberg had in his first target audience? Take a guess.
30.
Well, it was actually 5,000. It was his Harvard class, right?
I thought it was going to be small.
Well, that's still pretty small. He's got billions of users nowadays. He started with 5,000, right? The point is that Mark Zuckerberg had to create a product that would satisfy his Harvard classmates so that it got traction there. And maybe if that didn't work, maybe he had to think of a different target audience, but he had to start somewhere small. And so my discipline is very much focused on creating that initial narrative around something focused. When you get to advertising a much, much more mature product, you do have to think about multiple segments. But it's really useful if you can find some commonality, even if it's in a broader market. And maybe that's something psychographic. Maybe that's something about and when I say psychographic, it's something about the mindset of the individual that you're talking to. So, for example, take a product like the Peloton, which is something that is used by people probably from their 20s through their 70s, men and women. They probably tend to be more on the side of being fit than not fit, but there's going to be a very broad range. But there's something about all of those people that they have in common. And you have to identify those commonalities and then describe that character in your story in that way. And in that case, that character is probably someone who's trying to get more healthy, who likes to be competitive, who's kind of social, or even if they're antisocial, meaning it more, introverted, they still, there's something about connecting with people that's important to them. And now we're describing a psychographic that's a commonality that holds those people together. So if I'm going to create a message for Peloton, I'm creating a message focusing on that kind of person, even if it's many, many different segments ultimately that you could probably break out.
When you storyboard customer motivations and conflicts, how do you separate superficial pains from the deeper cinematic central conflict that actually moves audiences to act?
Great. So the way you do it is you focus on trying to discover. You think of yourself as a journalist. Think of yourself as a therapist. Think of yourself as an anthropologist. And what you're trying to do is understand the human thing that's driving the customer. And the way you do that is by constantly asking the question over and over again, why do you feel that way? Well, what makes you feel that way? Why do you feel that way? There's a great video that I show. It's actually a commercial in one of my classes to demonstrate it. And it's this 15-year-old kid. You'll be able to relate to this. I know you're probably older than 15, but this probably wasn't long ago. Goes into the DMV, and there's a woman behind the counter who's been there, done that, and done it a million times. And she's kind of staring at him like, "What do you want?" And he says, "I want a driver's license." And she says, "What do you really want?" And he says, "Well, I want to be able to, get around on my own." What do you really want? "Oh, well, I want to prove to my family that I don't need them, that I'm independent. I can go do my own thing." And so every time and of course the punchline of the joke is of the commercial, she finally says, "What do you really want? Really want?" And he says, "I want Reese's Puffs, okay?" She says, "Okay." And she gives him a bowl of Reese's Puffs at the DMV. So it's just a funny commercial, but what it's illustrating is that every time she asks him, "What do you really want?" she's getting closer to the truth, right? And this is something that's just a funny example, but that's something that we do even with the biggest companies in the world, thinking about their customers, even in business to business and tech. We have to constantly ask that question to find out what's going on. Let me give you an example of that from the business world. There's a company called Databricks, which I had the pleasure of helping them come up with their first narrative. They're based out here in the Bay Area, in Northern California. A bunch of Berkeley people, a couple of Berkeley grad students, a professor. They came up with a better way for handling and managing data and accessing it and discovering insights and pulling insights out of data. And as we started to try and get at understanding what was going on with the customer, we had to first figure out who's the customer. We realized it was data scientists and super hyperscaling companies where they needed to take this massive amount of data they were getting from their customers and use it to glean insights that would let them go after the competition. So we're talking to these people, we're trying to understand them. And it turns out that the people running the companies were putting so much pressure on them to solve all the company's problems. The company executives, the C-level executives would say, "We've spent a fortune to house data. We're spending all this money. I've now hired you as a data scientist. You go in there, you find that needle in the haystack, that insight, and bring it back to the business people so they can change the product or crush the competition and off we're going to go, and you're going to be the one who saves us." And they'd go back to their desks, and it would be like their hands were tied behind their back because it was so hard to manage and access the data. They were spending all their time just running programs to try and get access to the data, but they weren't getting any insights. So there was this huge gap between expectations up here and what they could deliver. And there was all this anticipation, I like to call it, between those two things. That's something any human being can understand, feeling that way. And that ended up becoming that emotional part of the story. We would, of course, detail all the things that made it hard to access that data and what they needed to do with the product to solve all those things. But at the core, there was this human need to be able to meet these expectations, which were so great. And they kind of knew they could if they just didn't have all this stuff that made it hard. And that's an example of digging in and asking, why do you feel that way? Why is that? Why is that? And eventually you get to the good stuff. And you have to do that with every single product, even a very technical product like Databricks. The punchline to that story is that company's still a private company. It's one of the 2 or 3 biggest pre-IPO companies in the world, valued at $100 billion now. And it's not just because we had a good story. That's a tiny part of it, but it certainly helped that we came out of the gate telling a really compelling story. They built a great product, made some great decisions, and built a great company.
Would you say there's a behavior that one can use to know that they've reached the true conflict? I guess how do you know when to stop asking the question?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's when you come up with something that you go, aha, I'd remember that. That's something I'd hold on to. There's a thing that I do with founders, and when they come through accelerators, and I'll meet with like say 20 founders in the course of 2 or 3 days, and listen to their stories. And I'd ask a lot of questions, and we're trying to dig in and find out like what's that thing that really resonates. What's the thing that's like, oh, that's going to land. That's something I'm going to remember. That's something that when I hear about it in a presentation, I'm going to hold on to. There was a guy who was creating a tool for, this is at Berkeley, at one of the accelerators, and he's in the robotic space. And he wanted to do something for people who are on work sites, job sites. And one of the things he said is, there's this tool people use in job sites, and he said the version 1.0 of the beta version of it was back, probably 2,000 years ago. It's called a wheelbarrow, and it hasn't changed in 2,000 years. And it was such a great concept that if you're working on a job site, you're working with this thing that just literally hasn't changed in 2,000 years. Can it possibly get better? And then he would talk about all the challenges for people who have to, carry big giant wheelbarrows full of rocks and stone and mud, and how it would be dramatically better for the job site and for the workers if they had a little help. And that's where the story started. So that was one example of something where, and understanding how the people who were doing that job felt about using a tool that was so archaic. Like, can we get, we've got AI doing all this and that in the white collar world. Can you give me something? And then of course the solution is a robotic wheelbarrow, that an AI driven robotic wheelbarrow that can navigate a job site, and go from A to B and go through all the different hoops it's got to get to do what a wheelbarrow has to do on a job site. But anyway, what is the thing in this story that's going to be the kind of thing that you're going to remember? And so in his pitch, what he did is, and I encouraged him to try, I said, find an old picture of a wheelbarrow, like maybe you could find something like from Chaucer, like one of those old British sort of hand drawings, woodcut drawings. And he found this incredible drawing from something from like the 13th century of this guy with giant, wheelbarrow. And it was just a great way of illustrating this thing simply hasn't changed. There's room for dramatic improvement here.
What differences do you see in how early stage startups versus Fortune 500s embrace storytelling and innovation? And how do you tailor your coaching for each context?
So I used to, in prior life, when I was working in advertising, work with the Fortune 500 companies. And there we would spend a lot of time doing research, and you'd have large number of constituents, and you'd often have many segments you had to work with. It's a very complex thing with lots of moving parts. With startups, they don't have the resources to do that kind of thing, and also the challenge is different because, as I said, they're trying to hit that first target customer, and figure out that first target audience and really gain traction there before they move on to others. So again, what it's about trying to find that core narrative, and you don't have the resources to talk to 100 people, although if you can go out and talk to 100 consumers, or businesses, that's always the best idea. But you have to give them the tools to say, this is what you're looking for, and talk to as many people as you can to gain these insights that we can then go out and build this strategy around. But it's much more of it's person-to-person combat, right? You're not doing big studies, although you obviously can. You're going out, you're talking to people, you're trying to ask those questions over and over again until that thing comes out. I hate hiring people. Craigslist is terrible because it does this and this. And it's those conversations, those one-on-one meetings, where the magic comes from. And then again, you're trying to come up with a single-minded initial narrative. I think they tend to be a little bit more compelling because they're so focused. Whereas oftentimes, as you get into the Fortune 500 world, you're dealing with brands and brand attributes, and it's a much broader. It's a very difficult challenge, but it's a very different challenge than trying to come up with a single story about a single set of customers who have these needs.
From J. Walter Thompson to Yahoo to today's tech scene, how has the role of storytelling evolved? Which Mad Men era principles still hold up, and which no longer serve modern founders?
That's a great question. Really great question. It's funny. I was at an event yesterday, where it was actually funny. It was an event where the Berkeley Haas School of Business, where I teach, is coming up with a new branding approach, and they just had their kickoff party yesterday. And I was in the back of the room with another person who's been in this business for a very, very, very long time, and we were talking about what role AI played in putting that together, and what role AI is playing in putting stories together today. And we were talking about what are the few things that AI can't do. And this person is a qualitative researcher, and he still believes, and I believe, there's still magic in going out and talking to human beings, describing an area of something that people are trying to accomplish, and having a conversation and listening to them and watching their face and seeing when they have a reaction that's really like you can feel it, it's palpable, they really don't like something, and then trying to understand why. And that whole process is still something that we were doing back at J. Walter Thompson, and we're doing all the way into that I started there in 1985. And we're doing all the way 40 years later in 2025. We still need to do that. Let me give you one more example of this, because I think examples are helpful. Think about going back to the Uber example I used earlier. It's very easy, I think, to talk about some of the functional things people didn't like about taxis. Maybe they didn't like that they didn't know whether their driver was going to be a good driver when they called someone up on the phone using the yellow pages back 40 years ago to get a cab. Or if they're standing on the side of the road, maybe they don't know when the next cab is going to come. If you're not in New York City, do cabs just come by all the time? Is it going to be a good driver? How am I going to pay? All of these questions. And so those are all functional needs that a user had when Uber came along and thought there's got to be a better way. But underneath that, there was this emotional thing. And I would argue that the emotional thing is, if you are the person who was ordering the cab, you felt completely out of control. You had no control over it. You didn't know when they were coming. You didn't know if they'd be a good driver. You didn't know if the cab would be clean. You didn't know how you'd be able to pay. Once you got in the cab, you didn't know how long it was going to take to get there, whether you'd be there on time. You were completely out of control. And in many cases, it's like, I have a meeting I have to get to. I have a plane I have to catch, right? I want to control that experience. So the only way to understand that is to talk to people about that experience and try and figure out what's going on. What's behind that? Why do you feel that way? And eventually you'll discover that insight, and then that becomes a huge part of the narrative, both the product that you're building, but also how you talk about it. We're going to give you the control back. Well, what do you mean? Well, you're going to know that it's a safe driver because they're going to get it. You're going to know what their ratings are, and you're going to know when they're coming because you're going to see a map and the number of minutes, and you're going to see when you're going to get to your destination, and all the payments going to have in the background. So you don't even have to worry about that. Now you're in control. And all of that stuff happens through investigation, exploration, conversation, and seeking that human insight like an anthropologist or a therapist.
And is what you're talking about, is that possibly where the idea or the narrative for Uber, or what the narrative of Uber was?
Well, it's interesting. Uber, so far with the Uber example, I've only described one side of the market. So this is interesting. There's a concept called a two-sided market business, which is, I call that a love story. What's a two-sided market? It's a market where you're not just providing the solution for someone. You actually have to create two sets of people who provide the solution for each other, and you bring them together. When I talked about Minted earlier, the company that puts designers and people who want stationery or wedding announcements, bringing them together, Uber's the same thing. In a two-sided market, you need to tell both stories. So part of the Uber story is the one I just described, and that's the part that's the consumer who needs the ride. But there's a whole separate side of that story in this love story. I call it a love story because the love story is always compelling when you get to know both characters in the story. Did you see Crazy Rich Asians? Did you ever see that movie?
I haven't, no.
Okay. It's a great movie about these two characters that, like, how are they ever going to end up together? And somehow they do. But what makes it compelling is you get to know each character and you wonder, like, they're so different. How are we going to put them together? But you have to know both characters in the story. So in this particular love story, the other character are people who want to make money in the gig economy. They've got a car. It's an asset. They like driving around. They may be kind of social. They have a life where it really would help if they could work at different times of the day and only when they wanted to earn extra money. We're now telling this whole, how can I give someone the opportunity to do that well, if I create this marketplace where you can actually pick someone up and take them somewhere, I'm filling their needs. And now you've got these two characters in the story that I built a platform to bring them together. So there you go. There's an example of that for Uber. But again, you have to consider both sides of that love story.
What mindset shifts do MBA students and first-time founders need to make to treat narrative and emotion as strategic tools rather than soft accessories to the spreadsheet?
I'm laughing because it's such a huge problem. It's interesting. Entrepreneurs usually get it a little bit better than students because entrepreneurs know they have to go out and pitch their business. And they're stressed about that and they want help with the pitch. And so they're a little bit more open-minded to hear about something that maybe they're being going to be doubting Thomases about, to use that old expression. Smart people don't want to think that emotion is going to help them. They're like, oh, if I just give the facts, another smart person is going to respond to the facts. So what you have to do, whether it's a student, a stubborn student, or an entrepreneur who believes it's all about the data and the facts, you have to help them understand how the brain works. So you have to talk about brain science. There can't be anything any more technical than the way a brain works. And our brains have literally evolved to respond to story. We crave stories. And the memory centers in our brain are connected in the same part of the brain as the emotional center. There's literally something, we get a dopamine hit when we something emotional, we feel something emotional, something funny, something scary, something kind of sad. We get a dopamine hit in our brain. Literally this chemical reaction happens. And dopamine, there's a writer who said it's effectively sticking a Post-it note in your brain that says, remember this. So that's the way our brains work. And so if you're choosing not to do something emotional in your story, you're literally choosing to make it dramatically less likely for someone to remember it because of the way the brain fires. Like, what rational person would leave that on the table? So you have to start, and I start all of my talks by helping people understand why storytelling is important and about these things that happen in our brain. And if you choose not to use them, good luck.
What are the most common mistakes you see in startup narratives? For example, feature lists, solution, first pitches, and can you share a story of a team that overcame one and what changed?
Sure. There's no question some people are start with this is the thing I've created. That's always a problem. Even getting past that, I can't tell you how many stories I've seen where they've only described the functional insights. This is something I keep hammering. Functional insights are important, and it's important to narrow them down to a few things that I can talk about. Going back to my Uber example, it's hard to pay. It's hard to know whether it's a safe driver. You never know when they're coming or when you're going to get there. Those are like three things. Okay, we're going to fix those three problems. But it's getting at the emotional thing. So most first drafts I get from founders don't include this emotional need. So we have to dig for that. We have to look for that. I'll give you an example of somebody, and this is going back to the love story example, of somebody who took this to heart, and by going from a solution sell to somewhat more of an emotional sell, they became hugely successful overnight. It's actually the forward of my book, Get Your Startup Story Straight. So one of my best friends from college, who we used to write musicals together in college and put them on, is super accomplished and later went on to run CNN. He was the president of CNN for about 6 or 7 years. Huge job. And then after that, he started a couple of startups, one of which is called Hang Media, which has been pretty successful. And he was telling me he was going out trying to raise some money for Hang, and he wasn't getting anywhere. What Hang Media is, well, actually, I'll tell you what Hang is in just a minute. But he wasn't getting anywhere. And it was right about the time where I had a manuscript for my book, and I sent it to him. I said, hey, could you read this and give me your thoughts? So he gets it. And he said his first reaction is, I don't need this book. I don't need David's book. He's like, this guy I'm telling you about, his name is John Klein, is also a screenwriter. He's like one of the best storytellers, and he's hysterical. He's amazing. And he's like, I don't need this stuff. But he humored me, and he's looking at it, and he comes across the bit on the love story. He goes, wait a minute, that's what my product is. And what he did, he said on the very next phone call I had with an investor out in case based in New York, he called some guy in the Silicon Valley. He said, I started by saying, hey, I want to tell you about this new business I'm doing. It's a love story. Okay, I said, what do you mean it's a love story? Well, there are these two characters who are desperate to come together. One of them is the millennial or Gen Z person who loves connecting with athletes, and right now they have to do it through this intermediary of that time it was Twitter, now X, or whatever other social media, Instagram, whatever. And I'd see what they're saying, but I can't have a conversation with them. And on the other hand, there are these athletes, pro athletes, who are trying to, unless you're LeBron James or Steph Curry, it's hard to build your brand, right? There's a lot of noise. There's a zillion professional athletes, and they want to connect with young people to build their brand. He said, this is a love story. These people are looking to come together and connect. And we built a platform that puts them together. And the person on the phone's like, that's really interesting. How do you do that? And now he's described the characters, what they're trying to do, and the benefit. And then he can now say, well, here's what we've done. And what they've created is something called Hang, where you can go in and watch a game. And while you're watching the game, there's celebrity, former athletes, and in some cases, celebrities watching with you. Kind of like if you're watching the Peyton Manning cast, the Manning cast on a football game. But you're actually in there like a Zoom, and you can talk to them, and you can be in part of the Manning cast, if you will, as a regular person, and that's Hang Media. And he said the guy gave him like his first major investment. He raised $4 million almost on the spot. And the point is, it took a story, it took an emotional narrative, moving away from this. Let me tell you about this platform I've created to bring together. He hadn't described why someone needed that. He hadn't explained why there's two sets of people who are desperately in need of coming together. He hadn't framed it as a love story, and that changed the game for him. And then he wrote the foreword for my book and told that story.
I mean, yeah, it is I'm trying to imagine myself as an investor, and I think that pitch, it does sound a lot more intriguing regardless of what the product is. So, yeah. So you talk about romancing the problem. How do you coach innovators to make the problem irresistible so investors and customers feel inspired by the challenge, not overwhelmed?
Yeah, so I always encourage people to talk about the specific versus the general. And let me give you an illustration of that. If you describe generally about a problem in an industry, that's rational, it makes sense. But if you tell me a story about a very specific example, now I'll carry that example with me. One of my favorite examples of romancing the problem is in a category where you wouldn't have thought we really needed a new solution. This goes back about 10 years, 10, 12 years, when someone who used to work for me back when I was at Yahoo, back in the heyday, this is almost 20 years ago, was 20 years ago, a woman named Shanlin Ma, super, super bright person from Australia, a woman from Australia. She was thinking of starting a business. And this is like 15 years after, or 10 years after her time at Yahoo. And she's got this partner named Nobu, and they're about to go in together. They want to start their first company. And it was right about the time where she was going to a lot of weddings. And at the time, there were plenty of places you could go to register online. This is 2013 by now. It's not like there weren't online registries, but they were cumbersome and they were difficult. And she tells this story. She said, I was invited to a wedding, and I go on this registry of a friend of mine. And she said, the only thing I could afford was a tiny silver teaspoon. Like, that's it. It's like one of her best friends in the most important day of her life. And the way she can honor her is by going in this registry and clicking on teaspoon and buying her a freaking teaspoon. And her friend, she's so upset. Shanlin was so upset about this. She calls her friend. She says, what's up with your registry? It's terrible. And her friend says, you know what? It was so hard to set up. I just gave up. I said to my mom, I don't want to deal with this. I got other things to deal with the wedding. You set it up. So her mother set it up. And she put on all the silver stuff, like she's going to need those things as priorities. So Shanlin described that to her partner, Nobu. And Nobu said, oh, my God, I'm recently married. And when my wife and I went through the other side of because it's a two-sided market, the other side of the problem, which was building the website, Shanlin's problem was she couldn't buy anything as the person going in to buy something on the registry. Nobu described the other side of the problem, which was creating the registry. And he said it was so hard. We almost got a divorce before we got married. That's the story she tells to describe why she went into this business. And that's the story she pitched. I call it the tiny teaspoon of doom story. So if she just went in and said, wedding registries aren't very customized and they're hard to navigate and they're hard to build, it would go in one ear and out the other. But if you tell the tiny teaspoon story and the fact that her partner almost got divorced before he got married, now you're going, wow, maybe this is a big enough problem. Tell me more about the problem. Tell me more about, and now you've hooked your audience and they're there with you. And that's all about romancing the problem. So a specific example that will stay with you, that's memorable, that's the way to beat a general observation. It needs to support the general observation, but you need that specific illustration that's memorable.
I'm thinking about how you've been referencing a lot, touching I guess the person you're speaking to emotionally, or in some way like that. And I wonder if it's common that people may drift away and may start talking about the story more so than selling or convincing, or just achieving their main goal.
So again, the story is a way of helping someone truly grasp and almost feel it in their bones what the issues are that need to be addressed, and then what the benefits are going to be of addressing. It's not the only thing. Let me describe a typical business pitch, a typical innovation pitch. It's, say, you have 5 minutes to tell your story. The first half is going to be what I call the product narrative. This is what I spend most of my time on the book because I think it's the hardest thing. What's the product narrative? It's where you introduce the customer, what's going on with them, what their issues are, what they're trying to accomplish, they're having a hard time accomplish, why they're having a hard time to accomplishing it, what problem you're solving, how you solve it, and what's the benefit of solving it, and how that solution is better than what they're already using. That's the product story. And if you can build some emotion into that by describing the struggles of a customer or the benefits of solving it for a customer, if you can do that, that first and most important part of the story will stay with people. Then the other half or third of your pitch is going to be the business story. How are you going to turn that into a business? What's the market size of the people you're going after? What's your business model? How are you going to make money? How are you going to go to market? Have you protected your IP? Do you have a good team to build this thing? Do you have any partners? All of those things are business questions you need to be able to answer, at least at a high level. And take it together, the product story and the business story, which is going to turn that successful product into a viable business. Take it together, that's what you need to do to sell the business. And the emotional piece of that is probably a small but an incredibly important part of it, because if I don't believe there's a customer with a problem and that it's a really big problem for them and that you can solve the problem and it's not done in a way that someone can remember, none of the rest of the stuff matters. So it's a core part of it. Is in no way, it's necessary but not sufficient. It's necessary, but there's also other things you need to build out that story.
How should founders weave metrics into their narrative without draining emotion? Are there rules of thumb for when to lead with data, when to save it, and how to visualize it?
That's a really good question. By the way, these are all really good questions, and I commend you all for coming up with a great set of questions for the interview. The key to data is weave it into the narrative. Use it to illustrate and punctuate the thing that you want to punctuate with a story. There's a clip that I show in a lot of my classes that's a scene from Ford versus Ferrari. Did you ever see that movie?
No.
It's a great movie. It's really a good movie. You should check it out. And if you like cars, even if you don't like cars, it's a really good movie. All right, so check out Ford versus Ferrari. In it, it goes back to the 60s when Ford was getting into the racing program, and they were competing at Le Mans. And it's about this guy named Shelby, who's played by Matt Damon, who's trying to convince the guy who runs Ford, who was a Ford, that he should be allowed to run the program a second year, because the first year was an unmitigated disaster. And in his pitch session with the chairman of Ford, it's one of the best scenes in the movie, the Matt Damon character, Shelby, he admits all the problems that he had and everything else, but then he says, but when we went down that Moson Strait at 218 miles per hour, old Enzo Ferrari, who ran Ferrari, ain't never seen anything like that. And he's sitting over there in Modena, Italy. It's pronounced Modena, but if you're Texan, it's Modena, Italy. And he's sitting there and he's quaking in his boots because he's seen us do 218 miles per hour in the Moson Strait. In the pitch, it was the only data point he shared. But he shared that point and he amplified it with the story by painting a picture of this guy, the competition, sitting in his office halfway around the world, freaking out about 218 miles an hour. So if you pick the right data points, the few data points, and I have several examples of this, but for the sake of this podcast, I'll just use that one, where you pick that one or two data points that illustrate the problem or the solution or the opportunity, and then that's the thing that stays with people, and you don't overwhelm them with data, and you build a narrative around it. And I just did that with you just now, so you will now remember 218 miles per hour because of the way I told you that number. If I just said at some point in a conversation that Ford back in the 60s got to 218 miles, you might not remember it. But it's embedded in a narrative. That's the way you make data sing.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the Post-it note you were talking about.
Yeah.
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 Can you share a before and after example where revising a startup story materially changed its trajectory, such as fundraising, conversion, or strategic clarity, and why it worked?
So I think some of the best startup stories, I've given you a few of those examples today of people pivoting, but some of the best startup stories are of pivots where people started with one thing and then moved to something else. And there's lots of examples of it, that you can find. I just got three different examples that I was just reading about, all of people thinking about different problems to solve, and then in that process, they've changed their narrative overall. One example was this person who was a designer who had created these bowls out of vinyl and sold them in the Museum of Art store in Manhattan, which is a pretty great place if you're going to try and sell something that's sort of a product, but it's artsy in MoMA in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. But that wasn't a scalable business, and she was trying to think of like other problems to solve. And that is looking at the storyboards, like who's a customer who has a problem that I can solve. I've got an idea of a sort of a technology or material, and these bowls were made of interesting vinyl that were used for outdoor furniture. And she had some of this great material, and she had it laid out on her desk. She's looking at it. She said, "Oh, this is interesting. That actually looks nice sitting on the desk, and it's got these sort of properties, like it repels water and other things." And she's like, "This would be a good placemat." And this was the woman named Chilowich who created the Chilowich placemat, which is now like dominates that category. And it's a multi-million dollar business. You go to any Sur La Table or Williams Sonoma, any Crate and Barrel, any one of those stores, that's what they sell. They sell these placemats. And that required thinking about there's a different problem I have to solve. When she was creating this beautiful bowl, that was like solving the problem of people who were looking for some beautiful new thing that they could put in their, in their dining room table or on a sideboard, and it would be pretty, but it wasn't functional. And there wasn't a need for a lot of those things. That was a different narrative. Now she was like, wait a minute, I think there's an opportunity here to solve a different problem, which is people wanting to set a table and have it instantly look clean and crisp and sexy and beautiful. But she could use them every day, and you take them and you put them back in the drawer and you wipe them off, and then you got these gorgeous things on the table. So that's an example I was just reading about recently. There's another one was when Canvas started, multi-billion-dollar business. The woman who started that business was a 19-year-old Australian woman, and she and her boyfriend at the time, they were 19, and she was trying to put some things together, some designs together, and she was using WordPress or something that goes way back, and it was very clunky. And she started to think, well, gee, what if we come up with a software platform to make it a little easier to do that online? She starts to build it with a software maker, and then they decided their first target customer should be people making yearbooks, because that was something that was being done by very amateur people or students in high school, no offense again, but they're not experienced designers. And they needed a tool. So she started with that very small segment with a very specific need to create yearbooks. And her first business was printing the people would use the software for free and then print the yearbooks. And she had a printer running in her mom's living room in Perth, Australia, making yearbooks. But ultimately she's like, wait a minute, there's problems. This is going to solve problems for anybody who's trying. And now it's a different narrative, right? It's not for someone trying to create a yearbook. It's for someone trying to solve any design problem where they want collaboration, because these were tools that were all online. So like a Google Doc, people could go in, you get feedback and share things and make changes. And she built that platform, and the story is now Canvas. So these are both cases of people who started with one direction, started thinking about opportunity, different segments, different problems to solve, and then they end up in a very, very different and incredibly successful place.
No, yeah, at school we use Canva all the time. But I did not know it came from that. How should storytelling differ for social impact ventures in health, education, or sustainability, especially when outcomes are complex, multi-stakeholder, and long horizon?
So great question. The advantage of working in that space is it's not hard to find emotional narratives. When you're dealing with people with things where the stakes are so high and so obvious, whether it's a something that's going to help save someone's life, or make the planet safer, or build communities, it's usually much easier to find those really compelling narratives. So that's the easier part. The harder part, as you said, is there's often lots and lots of stakeholders and lots of constituents. But I still think the power in this discipline is still keeping it focused and small. I have a philosophy which says start with a big giant picture. Imagine an image of an hourglass, right? So you start with this really, really big statement at the top. I want to tell you about an idea that's going to make life so much safer for women who want to give birth, which is a large percentage of the women on the planet ultimately will want to give birth. That's like a massive statement. Then I'm going to say, but let me start by telling you a personal story. And then I'm going to go narrow in this hourglass and be very specific and tell you a personal story. I have an example of a woman who told a story about blacking out when she was 13 years old, writing a paper on Emerson in her bedroom. She blacks out and wakes up in the hospital, and she realized she has a cyst in her uterus that could render her infertile or worse, and could have all sorts of serious complications. She starts telling the story. And then she goes on to say it was from that day that it set her out on this mission to try and solve what she describes as the greatest health facing women today, which is early detection of this type of cancer. And this goes back to this big picture. So here's what we're doing to solve this big, giant global problem. And you're now back at the back end of the story. We were saying, this issue, tens of millions of people, women every year face this question and blah, blah, blah. And now you're into the big picture story again. So my advice is start with a big vision, get very specific and illustrative so people can have the story land, and then go back to the big opportunity and how you're going to get there.
And this may be included in your explanation, but just to clarify, so who would the protagonist be from the stakeholders?
Well, in that particular example I just used, the protagonist is a woman,
Yeah.
in this case, a young woman who's coming on childbearing age.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing about a story like that is there's lots of different ways you could choose a protagonist. In any healthcare example, is it the patient? Is it the doctor? Is it the hospital administrator? Is it, the head of the emergency room? You could keep going, right? And so your job as the storyteller is to figure out through whose lens can I tell the most compelling story. In that example, it's usually the patient, but not always. Sometimes the best stories could be the story from the perspective of the doctor. It's usually the doctor or the patient. Sometimes it's the hospital administrator, but usually it's the doctor or the patient. But I always say just choose a protagonist. If you get caught up in trying to tell both of those stories, at least initially, it could be really confusing. So tell your story through the lens, say, of the patient. And then as you get to the back end and you start talking about the business opportunity, then you can introduce the doctor and the hospital administrator and talk about the benefits for them. But you've hooked me and grabbed me and made it memorable by telling the story of this patient who struggled with something really dire.
How has writing and producing for the stage shaped your approach to business storytelling? What specific techniques from theater, such as beats, blocking, and table reads, do you bring to teams?
So another great question. And by way of background for folks who might not have read my bio or whatever, half of my life I spend producing theater, and half of my life I spend teaching and coaching and advising people around storytelling in the business context. So I'm literally living this life. And what resonates on both sides, and what we learned from the theater side, is that it's all about finding the story. I'm working on one project that's in its 12th or 15th year, where we're still trying to figure out what is the ideal story to tell. And once we land the story, once we figure out how to come up with the most satisfying ending and have all the breadcrumbs lead up to that incredible resolution that really feels right and feels earned. Once you've done all of those things, then you could add all the layers that make the project. In this case, it's a musical. But it's always a question of discovering the narrative. And we're constantly going through the script and doing table reads with actors to and sometimes singing the songs and doing the readings and all of that together to see, are all the pieces fitting together? Is it going to land? And what that tells me for the business side is that you're constantly on this quest to find the resonant story. What is the thing at the heart of this? What's the thing that's going to make that story on the stage land? Is some great human insight. Maybe it's about people navigating guilt. Maybe it's a story about forgiveness. Maybe it's about both of those things. But once we have those underlying elements, then we can sort of amplify them in that production. Same thing is true in our business story, where we discover those great insights about what's going on with people, and then we look for new ways of telling that story and constantly revolving and trying new things, seeing what lands. You're going to get a chance to pitch your story a million times. I guarantee you, when Surbi Sarna, who tells the story about blacking out as a 13-year-old, when she first told that story, she might not have started with, "I was writing a paper on Emerson." But somewhere along the line, she added that, and that really landed for people. Why? Because it says it was a day like any other day. You've written papers. I used to write papers. My kids wrote papers. We can all picture that happening. It's like a day. It's what you do every day, right? Yep. Well, if in the middle of one of those things you black out and you wake up in the hospital, it's like, oh my God, right? So somewhere along the way, she discovered I was writing a paper on Emerson was a useful thing in that story because it makes the contrast of waking up in the hospital after having blacked out so dramatic. That's what happens to us as storytellers. We're constantly searching for those little things which will sing, which will resonate, which will make a story really work and be memorable. And it's a constant quest of vision and revision until it's opening night.
With AI, VR, or AR, and new media formats, what is genuinely new about telling startup stories? And what timeless narrative structures should founders keep anchoring to?
Well, I think one of the things that at least AI helps with is it could show you a good example of what a good story can look like. So once you've built your storyboard, and in my book I talk about this narrative storyboard, there are these 6 boxes, you got to fill them in. Once you've filled that out and you've answered those strategic questions, you could drop that into Gemini, chatbot AI, whatever you want, whatever chatbot you choose, and say, please turn this into a proper story. Turn this product narrative into a proper story. And it's going to spit out in a matter of seconds a good little story. And so that's a really useful tool because it shows you the kind of story that you can get. And is that a good enough story, or what do we need to make it stronger? And it sets it's like a role model for you, but it's still not good enough. And this is where the human comes in. Then I challenge you as the storyteller to go find a real story from either your experience or from a customer experience that's better than the made-up story that came from the chatbot. Because the chatbot story isn't a real story. It's a made-up story about characters that the chatbot's created. You want to come up with a real story. And all of the stories I've shared today are actual stories, with the exception of Ford versus Ferrari, which is based on a real story. It's a scene from a movie. But all those other things are things that have actually happened. And they make those stories more compelling because they're real. They're just not. Imagine a story where an inventor no, these are all actual stories that I know because I crossed paths with them in my experience. And I'm now sharing them with you today. So AI can help us get to that really good story model, but then our job is to take it the next step and make it authentic and make it genuine. So it can really be a help along the way. I would say AI is the major tool that can help us with that.
And I have one final question that we ask all of our interviewees, and it's, how do you define success both personally and professionally?
So for me, it's all about feeling useful. If I in my life can be useful, that's not a bad place to start every day. And it's a really interesting thing. I would not have always said that. I would have probably said, oh, if I have a good career, um, and if I have a great family, and I'm very fortunate that I've had a great career, I have a great family, I now have a grandchild, which is awesome, um, and all these things, and all of that stuff is something that's, of course, those are things that are important for me, but especially now. And I think this is not a bad thing to sort of have as sort of a signpost for your life. If you can be useful, you're going to have a purpose, right? What useful means, there's someone who needs what you're offering, whether it's you as a parent, whether it's you as an advisor, a friend, a mentor. If you can be useful and helping artists achieve their vision, if you can do any one of those things, you're being useful. And if you're being useful, then you have like a reason to wake up in the morning. You have a purpose, because I know like these folks are going to benefit from some of the things that I can do. And if you can marry what you're best at to a need, then you're probably the best likelihood that you're going to be able to be useful, because you're going to take something that you're really skilled at, or you've gained experience in, or you're naturally sort of inclined to be able to do, and you're applying to a place where people are like, yeah, I could use some of that. And if you can be useful in your life, especially as you get to my age, that's a really nice place to be, to have a reason to get up every morning and maybe provide some guidance or help or support, help something happen that maybe otherwise wouldn't have happened in the same way if you weren't there.